Hello, welcome to another edition of Razor Wire. Now, today we have a spotlight on technology, and today what we're going to be looking at with our spotlight on technology is attack surface management. Understanding what you're doing, what your technology is doing, how vulnerable you are, supply chain management, absolutely everything around understanding within a business or an organization where you stand at any one space in time was one of the biggest things that we worry about as InfoSec people, and we're going to explore that today. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to the guest that I have. And today, in order to discuss the importance of attack surface management and one of the sort of hottest topics within the market at the moment, and to kind of review where we've been, where we're going, and what the trends are in this particular space, I have brought in Censys, one of the big players in this space, and they have sent me the wonderful Nick Palmer. Nick, do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners, viewers, whoever's watching or viewing this, as to who you are, what your background is, what you got, what you do?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. And thanks for having us on. It's been, really, really nice to start to consider how we would position and talk about some of these things for a podcast. So I've been with Censys a little over a year now. And I think if I were describing my career, I wouldn't want to go back too far because early on in my career, it seemed to career from one place to another, which I think is why I describe it as a career in the first place. So I joined the forays of IT about 25 years ago, and did an awful lot around IT service management and performance and user experience. And I got into security probably around 2009 and have never looked back. So, I think it's still a thrilling place to work. And also a place to work where you feel you can make a difference. I think particularly if you are operating at the sharp end, the places where you see attackers and where money starts changing hands, then it's easy to feel you are actually contributing. So I've been very fortunate with my career. And so most recently, I started with attack surface management and with Censys about a year ago. But prior to that, I'd done work in and around deception, so honeypot type technologies, and also SIEM, log management, data acquisition, attacker insights, attacker intelligence, those kinds of things.
Fantastic. What a career. I mean, like yourself, all the viewers know my background, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But, I've been in InfoSec for like 30 odd years, on the coalface, so to speak. And I think in one of the things that I always come back to, and it's something that a lot of our listeners have heard me say again and again and again, as well as people who've come to watch me sort of speak at events and what have you. I love going back to that Sun Tzu quote, where he basically says, if you know yourself, but you don't know your enemy, you're only going to win 50% of the time. If you know your enemy, but not yourself, you're going to win 50% of the time. If you don't know either, you're kind of screwed. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing here. And if you know both, then there's no reason for you to fear the outcome of any particular battle. Now, that last statement, I think, things can happen even if you know yourself and you know what your enemy is. You can still get surprised, but at least you've got the ability to kind of figure out where you are, what you're doing, and all the rest of it. And it's been a significant part of information security from years before I even got into it, with the earliest stage people where, I guess in many respects, and it'd be interesting to get your viewpoint on this, the 90s and the early 2000s for IT alone, just when you look at it, it was a fresh and interesting place to be. We didn't have the tools that we had today. It was very down and dirty. And the amount of change that occurred from, the inception of like commercial internet and the changes that businesses went through, it was scary. I don't know what your thoughts were, but I mean, how was it for you when you first got in? I mean, like me, you're a bit of a, I doubt, obviously, I'm not calling you old, but, you've been in the game for a while now.
Well, the old cap fits and I will wear it. I guess from the perspective of my earliest forays into IT, I mean, I was working, believe it or not, for a microfilm bureau. So this was an organization that was involved in taking paperwork of various sources and committing it to microfilm. And they then kind of moved into digital scanning, so document scanning, then where you could store the microfilms basically on disks. And the organization I was working for had a big microfilming bureau. There were about 100 people in a warehouse scanning documents or microfilming documents. And we started to win big customers, large corporate customers who were looking at getting their documents archived and put to digital media. And I remember the IT manager at the time kind of came to me after he'd had a grilling from one of these prospective customers. And he said to me, yeah, they wanted to know all sorts of details about our IT setup. And he said, they asked me about firewalls. And he said that with a look on his face. And I didn't know what a firewall was at the time. This was many years before there were commodity things. And just starting to think about, the very possibility that the internet in its very earliest days didn't even have these things that we call commodity controls, and just about how easy an attacker would have found it if he were to stumble upon a network that was unprotected by firewalls and contained confidential information committed to digital media for a large organization, a large bank, or a large defense type organization. So those early days were, I think it's more really with the benefit of hindsight. You can, view them in the rear view mirror as, and think, my goodness, we were really learning as we went back then.
No, absolutely. Back then, technology was still very, very early. We didn't have things like the firewalls, the data protection solutions. You were lucky if you had a bit of antivirus, in all honesty. And understanding what you had in an environment where technology was moving so quickly. And dare I say it, IT firms back then had a much bigger problem with shadow IT than we tend to have now, because people were doing all kinds of stuff. I mean, I knew IT people who'd create Quake servers to play with their mates on games, on company stuff. The ability to understand where people were saving things and whether they were saving things in the right place, or whether people have been attaching their own devices was a big thing for quite a while as well. And just so understanding kind of the security of your organization was a far harder thing to do. I mean, we did have scanning tools, the early day stuff that would go out and scan networks, and kind of tell you what it found on the way back. But there was no nice visuals. There was no stats you could get from it. It was just like, you look through a massive long report that would tell you, oh, look, here's a Mac device. And it's like, well, we're a Windows environment. What the bloody hell's a Mac device doing? Where is it? Whose is it? And you could only get very limited information. In some cases, you had to go out and walk around trying to find out which idiot plugged their Mac in or brought their kid in to plug their Mac in. So it was kind of a Wild West back in the day. And I think this is where I think a lot of that need has come into as networks have gotten larger. We've gone to virtual, which made things even more difficult because, I mean, I remember the day when something went wrong with the server. You'd go into the server room, it'd be probably labeled. You get the key to the cab, you'd open it up, you'd go in, you start having a look to figure out what the hell's gone wrong with it. Why is the Exchange server fallen over? Why is something misbehaving? Why is something suddenly blue screened? Which was it's a regular event now, but back then, yeah, it could be even more regular and more fun. Let alone trying to figure out in the log files. And you kind of mentioned earlier on your background and scene. I've had to do the kind of hunting through log files over several hours to find what's going on in the infrastructure, and trying to kind of fault find just the IT, let alone the security aspects where if people have gotten in, they're doing their absolute utmost to try to prevent you from seeing that somebody is in there. I mean, eventually they will get found out. I think all of the hackers and crackers at the time, and I use the old term crackers because I don't like the hacking term really. It was so much easier for them to hide if they did get in. I mean, yes, it was a different world back then when it came to those malicious actors because they were never as sophisticated as they are now. And I think in a lot of cases, with a lot of people just mucking around rather than doing what they do today, which is like full on ransomware and installing things into your network. That came a little bit later on, but I mean, is that kind of in line?
Yeah, relatively later on. I mean, because in the earliest days, and I don't want to dwell too much on history here, but I mean, you will remember NT 351, and prior to that, Windows for Workgroups, and also,
Yeah.
Nowhere at the time. These were the de facto networking tools, and they were really designed to establish connectivity. And when you started troubleshooting issues with networks back then they were shared media. These were hubs, not switches, and
Mhm.
you were a lot on physical connectivity and tools like ping. And then with connectivity came, obviously then the abuse of connectivity,
Mm.
particularly with the open internet. And then, again, with connections not even being secured with firewalls, it became much, much, much easier. I'm interested, and maybe this is a little bit of a segue, but I'm interested in your objection to hacker versus the use of the word cracker, but maybe that's one for later in the conversation.
Oh, I could quickly go into that one. I mean, hackers originally, the original term hacker was very much based around kind of like people who would try to get that technology to do something it wouldn't necessarily be designed to do, but not necessarily in a malicious way. I mean, you had a few people who did that. But I think it's a term that comes from a time when we was all so new to technology and we were sort of, just finding our steps. It's like a toddler trying to figure out how to walk. And suddenly they figure out how to run, and boom, before you know it, everything's running around, and that comes from a kind of much nicer time. Cracker was the kind of term at the time, people who cracked into systems who shouldn't have been there. But now, obviously, the hackers is a bit of a derogatory term. I mean, I am a bit old school, I suppose, but yeah, that's where my view on that one comes from.
Understood.
I've been around the block a few times.
Tomato, tomato, maybe, but
So yeah, I mean, it was a Wild West, and then we started getting other tools. We started getting kind of like tools that would look at your email. It would filter out the stuff, because I must admit, and I say to people I mentor now, some of the stuff you used to see before we had these kinds of tools would make your eyeballs bleed. And yeah, it was a much more difficult time to kind of control the environment, because you just didn't have the ability to do that. But we started getting those tools, and again, in the early days, they were a bit cumbersome. We were still finding our way, and because IT was moving at the speed of light and developing so quickly, it was kind of hard to build security tools that would keep up with the rate of change. Whereas now we need to keep security well versed in what's going on around the environment, because if we don't, you can get compromised in minutes. If you're really not doing what you should be doing, the speed from somebody targeting you to actually getting in has comparatively dropped in timescales quite significantly.
potentially. I mean, we should probably focus on the different vectors. I think that conversation, it's incumbent on us to at least focus on that, because there are a number of ways an attacker can gain access to a network, and the obvious ones are the spear phishing emails, and they're getting better. AI is meaning that now that you are less likely to find spelling mistakes in those kind of covering emails. They will be well worded, and they might, even if the attacker's done his reconnaissance on social media, they'll reference your tastes and your preferences, maybe even members of your network. And if you are less than judicious about your social media settings, and you, for example, have said you're going to a gig on Friday, then they can respond tactically with something very specifically to target that. And you will probably click on the link. And if you then, you compromise a machine by, go to a drive-by or clicking on a, watering hole attack in your browser, then the attacker's teleported straight into the middle of the network. Supply chain attacks, though, for example, you hack one company, and then all of a sudden you've teleported into the middle of potentially 2,000 or 3,000 networks. And I use things like the SolarWinds Orion hack as an example here. As a hazard of having publicly trialable software available for download, these executables are going to be in criminal labs under a 1 million watt spotlight, and they are going to be being dissected for vulnerabilities. And so, when you start thinking about those methods, these are all ways that the attacker can basically teleport straight into the soft GUI center of what is otherwise an externally fortified network. But that external fortification will have open doors and windows in it as well. And I think that's certainly from a Censys perspective, this is one of our focuses. It's like, what do you have that's facing the internet? You mentioned obviously gray market and black market IT. Supplier sprawl and the cloud providers have made that potentially worse, because any marketing executive can go with his own credit card to a Heroku or a DigitalOcean or anything like that and stand up internet-facing infrastructure. And if it's fallen outside those normal governance frameworks, the things that you would insist if you were running a DevOps process, we don't want SMB exposed to the internet. We don't want RDP exposed to the internet. We want certificates that have at least got a little bit of governance to them, self-signed certs and Let's Encrypt, possibly not the best choice for well-governed organizations. And so, with assets being spun up on behalf of organizations that are identifiable directly and attributable to those organizations, it proliferates the attack surface and then can create real problems. And that part, and I guess you kind of alluded to this, is that it's a visibility gap. You can't secure things that you don't know about, particularly not if they have customer IP or anything monetizable that an attacker can use.
Oh, I totally agree. And I mean, the movement to software as a service, virtualization, all these kinds of newer, I call them new technologies, so they're not really new anymore, but some of the latest breaches, good example, have not necessarily been the supplier providing the service. It's been a supplier to them. You've seen some of the big players, who deal with kind of government contracts, who specifically, I think recently, well, kind of last year, have had significant issues, where they're using a specific technology to move kind of data from one place to another that the customer never actually sees. It's part of the whole offering. And there's a whole chain of security now that organizations need to look at to try to sort of protect their own environments. When we had our networks ring-fenced in our own data centers, in our own offices, if you were a large organization or, outsourced, but you controlled all of those kinds of applications that were running within that environment, you had a lot more control. Now you don't. It's like, I mean, I'm an auditor. I've been a PCI auditor for years, and you hear people say, well, we outsource all of this to these guys. And I say to them, well, have you done your due diligence with them? What do you mean? Well, they're a large company. Their security must be great. And it's like, you need to check this. You can't just assume,
Spoiler alert here, you can't outsource risk. No. Much as you would like, you can't.
Absolutely. And try explaining to your C-suite, oh, it's not us that had the breach. It's like, well, the service provider of the service provider that had the breach. C-suite's not going to care.
GDPR regulations are, 20 million euros or 4% of turnover, and that's non-negotiable. So
absolutely, and we've seen a lot of people fall afoul of that. And I think as IT's criticality for us to do business has grown meteorically over the years, the need to secure that and understand what you have, where it is, what does it look like, what's vulnerable, what's not vulnerable, has only grown. I mean, I remember a time when patching was kind of let's just kind of do it as and when we need to do it. If we don't have a problem, then let's not patch kind of thing, which was a very, very, very old school, I might point out, way of working. Whereas now, well, yeah, unfortunately, I do come across it a fair bit.
I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but I mean, I've always seen that, operational IT is kind of like balancing a pile of plates. And let's not make any changes if we don't have to, because it's balanced right now. And if you affect that plate, third one up from the bottom, then there's a chance the whole stack is going to topple. And so, I think that's and this segues very directly into a risk-based conversation. There may well be vulnerabilities that you've got exposed that you can necessarily prioritize down, for example, because they may not have a known exploited vulnerability in the wild, or they may be connected to less business critical systems. And again, it's a visibility gap. You have to know not only the systems that you have, but how they contribute to services and how those services then contribute to the bottom line. Because you mentioned the C-suite, those guys are just going to be interested in the corporate ratios, EBITDA and those kinds of things, profitability ratios. The tech guys are going to be interested in what they consider to be, critical vulnerabilities. Let's take exposed RDP, for example. An exposed RDP connection to the network might be supporting business critical services. Now, but that said, it's still not necessarily desirable, because an Amazon M4 large instance can send 60 million passwords a second into an exposed internet-facing RDP interface. Now, sure, the interface itself will fry long before that. You won't get a tenth of the way into your 2 terabyte rainbow table before that interface falls over. But what if you've got exposed credentials on the dark web? Because that way, that exposed interface is a login. It's not a vulnerability. And the attackers can just jump into there, pivot across the DMZ into the core network, and it's game over. So
absolutely. And I mean, you cross into something really important there about threat intelligence and, understanding that, there are access brokers. I mean, access brokers weren't a thing when I was, young and bushy tailed to this environment. Now it's big business, and I mean, I guess, with the changes that we've seen in the way that malicious actors work, I mean, it's now, you read sort of Brian Krebs when, all the notes came out about some of the hacking groups and how they worked. They work like organizations now, You could compare them to any normal, legitimate organization, and you could see a lot of crossovers. They've got HR, they've got developers, they've got people who go out and find it's like salespeople go around. Or obviously they're not salespeople going out and finding the companies to attack and all the rest of it. And it's become more and more dangerous to not deal with security over time, which leads us and segues us very, very neatly into where we are today, which is we're seeing a lot more legislation like DORA obviously coming out. We've got NIS2 coming out. There's a lot of updating going on around the world with various different kind of security legislation. And it's not just frameworks anymore that we need to worry about. It's actual legislation where, like, for instance, DORA, if you don't handle your security and you are the C-suite, then you will potentially not only incur a fine for your organization, but you will get criminal charges to you as a fiduciary duty that you haven't facilitated security for the organization. Obviously, with DORA, it's pushed more towards finance and people who supply finance, but that's going to push out, and that's not going to change.
I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind there as well. I mean, when we talk about legislation and compliance fines, we risk losing sight of what's really important here. I mean, and this is going to sound like a naive perspective, but let's say, for example, a DORA compliance fine or a GDPR fine, it hits the bottom line massively and significantly. But let's remember what those fines are designed to do. They're designed to place an incumbency on organizations to jealously defend the data and the IP of their clients and customers. And this is the most important part. I mean, what are we in business for? We're in business to make money, and the compliance conversation is going to be an important one. But what do we believe organizationally? Do we believe in the sanctity of our customer data? Do we believe in making the investments necessary to defend it? Do we believe in investing in our people to make sure that they have got that same prevailing credo? When I think about my customers' data, I think about the things that I would spend most effort defending. It's like, what are our priorities? Why are we doing this? The compliance fines are important, and the execs are necessarily focused on them. But us at the ground level, do we believe in this stuff viscerally? And are we taking all of the necessary steps? Does this permeate our consciousness enough to make us want to start to defend these things, even in the absence of a financial slap on the wrists, or worse?
And you've just described a really good podcast that I'm probably going to be doing in the new year. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a duty of these organizations. And I think, times are changing where it was like, I mean, it's still going to be risk-based. There's still going to be risk-based determinations of whether you do take an action or you don't take an action, or whether you secure something or whether you don't secure something. But I am seeing a significant change when I do the consultancy aspects, or my guys do the consultancy with CISO as a service, that there is a lot more, conscious effort now from sort of C-suite executives that they do need to look after things like customer data and all the rest of it, not just from a legislative purpose, but because, it's going to look terrible on them themselves if they don't do it. Nobody wants to be in that thing. I mean, there's been cases where people have had big events in the past, and those CEOs have said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," and you see them go out with a golden handshake or golden parachute, and they're just into the next company. I think that's actually going to change quite dramatically, and I think obviously we've got the legislation, but I think times are changing now, and if you don't handle security and you don't understand what you're doing within the organization, be it the business level, be it the information security level or be at the IT level, you're going to come a cropper, and it's going to be remembered,
And I think from that perspective, because, we've all grown up, with this prevailing view of us as the weakest link, us end users. Me personally, for example, I'm apparently the culprit. I am the guy that clicks on the spear phishing email links. I'm the guy that has my identity badge on display in public transport. But if we think about, the human cost of security, because I don't like to say that the problem is the end user because it's so hackneyed, it's almost cliched now. But again, let's look at that. There was an organization that did a comparative risk assessment, and they were comparing the associated risk of having 50,000 direct employees with other things that might be wrong with the infrastructure. And they described an equivalent risk of having 25 external applications in your environment. In other words, vendor-sourced applications that you have no control over the code for, as having the same equivalent risk as 50,000 employees. You just imagine that level of equivalence, because again, if you're thinking about, things like this, things like the SolarWinds hack, for example, where one single compromise can teleport an attacker right into the core networks of tens of thousands of companies. I'll give you another example, actually, this is one that's maybe not necessarily relevant to the conversation, but it's an anecdote that I like to spout whenever I get the chance. So I was working, I mentioned before, in a deception environment, this with honeypots. And we were working on our hospital network. And we decided to put down a deceptive MRI scanner onto a hospital medical device network. So you're probably aware, these assets, these medical devices, the MRI scanners have got commodity operating systems behind them. So this particular one had a version of Windows 2012 server on it. We put it onto this network. This was basically a virtual machine that was designed to behave like an MRI scanner. Yeah. Within 2 minutes, it was being talked to by an X-ray film printer on the same network. And the X-ray film printer had uploaded a version of Configure to this MRI scanner and was instructing it not only to scan the network for medical records, which you will know are the most monetizable form of PII, but also to try and update itself by trying to burrow out to the internet to get a new version of Configure on itself. So I told them about this. They pulled up the drawbridge. I was escorted from the room because you never get involved in the fun conversations as a vendor. But I found out later that what they'd done is they contacted the manufacturer of the X-ray film printer and said, "You've got malware on this. Can we have a new firmware for it?" And they supplied a new firmware, and the same thing happened again and again. And as it turns out, the X-ray film printer manufacturer had a new neighbor in Beijing who got onto their wireless network and was poisoning the firmwares at source. 10,000 compromised devices in circulation. Now, again, one single medical record has got a black market value of $40 because of the possibilities for blackmail and because of connections to things like insurance interfaces. And so when you start thinking then about the multiplier effect of things like either supply chain attacks or external facing vulnerabilities, it becomes, again, incumbent on all of us to have all of these things in mind when we're looking at tackling attack surfaces.
I think this is the thing, though. I think a lot of people forget that, this is how some compromises occur. It's not just somebody getting into a system and, directly. Sometimes it is through your third parties. It is through software that you have. I mean, obviously, let's use SolarWinds. We've used it a few times. That wasn't just kind of commercial organizations that were potentially compromised. That was government institutions compromised, some big government institutions, some very important government institutions who really don't like getting compromised. They really don't want that. Which leads us to segues us into why, understanding your kind of attack surface is really, really important. I mean, it's a hot topic. I've recently, I don't know when this is going to go out, but I recently came back from Black Hat, and it was kind of a big aspect of Black Hat as well. What is it about attack surface management today? And I'm looking down at the clock. It's nearly Christmas. It's like, is it still 2024? What is it about attack surface management today that's so important? Why? What trends are you seeing from the people who are coming to you and saying, Nick, I really need to get this network in order. I need to understand where I am, what I'm doing, and how it all works, and what the deal is with security. What is it that you guys are seeing? Why are people coming to you?
So I think the primary thing seems to be velocity, attacker velocity. And let me explain what I mean by that, because it used to be the case that a critical internet-facing vulnerability or exposed service would be discovered by an attacker typically within 30 or 40 days. Now, I mean, we were speaking to a major defense supplier, one of the big guys, who said that if we have an inadvertent configuration on our external-facing attack surface, it's found by an attacker within 3 hours. Now, I mean, if you imagine from that perspective, what this indicates is a continual visibility of organizations' attack surfaces by attackers. So what's the possible cause for that? Well, let's take, for example, some of the particularly successful groups. You mentioned ransomware earlier. Ransomware smash and grab is obviously only one of the tactics that the bad guys use to get paid. But I think it was CryptoLocker or one of those guys, CryptoWall, someone like, and they made $300 million in 1 year from ransomware. Now, that buys you not only a lot of high-performance computing to crack NTLM hashes and stuff like that, but it also buys you a lot of resources to stand up to be using open source scanners to scan your target's environments. And as soon as you see an open window, you jump on it. So I think particularly from an EASM perspective, because an awful lot of the other commodity attacks, things like spear phishing emails, there are good organizations that are doing the drills, and we're improving culture in users around being careless around their security settings. But the external facing attack surface is a very organic thing, because the velocity thing that I've mentioned in relation to attackers applies to businesses as well. New services, new collaborations, open interfaces for third-party suppliers. And so with this kind of rapidly changing external attack surface, with these little glitches and vulnerabilities and exposed certs and exposed interfaces, the attackers are jumping on those. Correspondingly, we need to be keeping constant visibility of those interfaces as well, and more importantly, attributing them to the organization. I mean, an IP address in, let's say, in Worcester, is interesting, particularly if it's got an exposed attack surface. But if you look into an associated certificate on that, and you see a domain that is a critical national infrastructure supplier, or you see, a major bank, then all of a sudden you've potentially got a vector into one of these organizations. And the costs, for example, in a bank, the attackers will go straight to the SWIFT network or to some of the automated payment systems. Critical national infrastructure, you mentioned Black Hat. I gave a talk at Black Hat about exposed CNI, and I gave a talk about Stuxnet, because I still think it's a very, very important use case. And some of the other things that we've learned about exposed attack surfaces in the interim. There was a thing called Colonial Pipeline. Colonial Pipeline happened, I think, in 2020. And basically, they ransomware the entire East Coast fuel delivery system, the kerosene, the diesel, the petrol. And it was a $4.5 million ransom. And, the payload itself was just exploiting commodity vulnerabilities and external facing vulnerabilities. Now, as it happens, there are organizations like Chainalysis who can, attribute the Bitcoin distribution back to the numerous empty barbershops that seem to exist on British high streets these days. Not to say that they're all money laundering, but I mean, it seems to be peculiar that most of them are empty. And but anyway, I think from that perspective, the ecosystem around not only exploiting these vulnerabilities but also then extracting the cash and cleaning it means that there's quick money to be made. So that velocity question about discovering the attack surfaces, because it's basically low-hanging fruit. If you have constant visibility on a target organization and you know the value you can derive from them, then as soon as there is an open window, you jump into it.
Yeah, and I can validate. I can definitely validate a lot of that. I'm seeing a lot of my customers at the moment, and a lot of people approaching us because we do like continuous penetration testing, where we take that snapshot in time pen test and we stretch it out over the 12-month period, which is great synergy with things like attack surface management, because obviously, we've got the pen testers looking at actual kind of business logic issues, that kind of stuff, which you can kind of understand your attack surface, but there are nuances around how people sometimes get in that kind of go beyond just understanding what the technical vulnerabilities are, because again, it goes back to that kind of hacker pseudonym that we were talking about earlier on, getting things to do things in a way that you don't necessarily want them to do. And we've seen a lot of it with AI, for instance, a lot of people gaming AIs to get outputs that they shouldn't necessarily get because they haven't programmed. So it's really interesting dichotomy, but you're absolutely right. The market is changing. There's a lot of need now to understand where you are, what's going on, as closely as you can to real time. I mean, you'll never get it completely down, I don't think. There's still going to be a bit of a leeway and a lag. But gone are the days where, we do an investigation once every 6 months, which is how we used to do it.
Absolutely. And I think, from that perspective, because you mentioned the hacker versus cracker thing, I think when you start thinking about the creative ways that hackers approach this problem, there's a guy in my network who is quite a famous hacker. I'm not going to name him, but he said to me recently that he's been experimenting with installing NT4 on a Nintendo Wii. And I just started thinking, and having it facing the internet, and I just started thinking, my God, the risk associated with that, but he seemed perfectly comfortable with it because he just wanted to mess around and have a tinker and just see if this, this particular system, and apparently it runs it just fine with all of the associated. Exactly right. So I think from that perspective, when you have that level of creative problem solving within the black hat community, then, and it goes back to something you said earlier about fear and about having a risk mindset, is, I am in constant awe of the creativity, the resourcefulness, and the absolute audacity of some attackers. If only we could convert more of them to the light side, because the way that some of these guys think is absolutely astonishing in terms of exploiting and finding these vulnerabilities. I think the bug bounty programs now are finally starting to keep pace with the black market. You can go to Microsoft and to Google, and they will give you something approximating what you could get for a 0 day on the dark markets. But if you're less than ethical, you want to monetize it double time, then you can send it to the dark market first, and then give it to Google. So it's an interesting environment.
Oh, there's so much I could say about this. And again, I might call you back for a podcast on this one, because you and I are aligned in many respects. Because I have concerns, for instance, around crowdsourced penetration testing services, not validating who you're bringing on board. Again, there's all kinds of things we can go down, but let's go back to the kind of like attack surface management. So what have Censys got? What have you got that fixes the concerns that us information security professionals have about understanding where we are, what we're doing, what we've got, and what our IT people, bless them, I love IT, I come from an IT background, I just want to clarify that before I get lynched. But what can we do to protect our organizations and to help the IT departments and the various governance departments understand what we're facing? Because that's really what it comes down to in many
Absolutely
respects.
Right. And I think, from the perspective of an external attack surface, if you're looking at it any less than daily, you're missing a trick. It has to be scanned at least daily, preferably in real time. And I think, this is one of the key things that we see. Censys began life out of the University of Michigan in the mid-2010s. A gentleman called Zakir Trumerich had stood up an internet scanning infrastructure. He was responsible for ZMAP, which is where the Z in ZMAP comes from, Zakir. And that then became open source. But then when he decided to decommission the infrastructure, a bunch of companies came out of the woodwork and said, "We love this data, please keep producing it." So now Censys is scanning the internet every single day, the whole internet. 2.8 billion assets, SNI infrastructure, IPv4, IPv6, with constant visibility of exposures, configurations, certs, certain misuse, attacker infrastructure. And the use cases that we put that to are everything from threat intelligence and attacker visibility into attack surface management. The difference being that it is updated every single day. Whenever you look at an attack surface dashboard within Censys, it's being updated continually. So those open doors and windows that you're not aware of, you have the opportunity to keep pace with attackers in terms of that visibility. And you have to keep driving the length of the exposure down. We work with organizations, big organizations, they'll have, an attack surface that's visible, and some of the exposures have been open for days, weeks, even months, sometimes years. And so from that perspective, this constant pressure to drive down the length of exposure, but also the severity of the exposures is really, where the secret sauce comes in, because constant visibility and continual visibility of the attack surface is necessary with the attacker ecosystem that we've been describing. High velocity, well-resourced, very, very creative, very intelligent, and very, very motivated.
Absolutely, and it's something that we've been crying out for really for a long, long time. I mean, as I said, we've had tools in the past that have helped us do this kind of thing, but never at the scale that we have, and never with the ability to do what we can do now. And I mean, one of the things that I've seen a lot of is there's a lot of organizations out there who are now starting to redefine their defense in depth. And I think one of the big missing pieces out of that is that attack surface management and that visibility of, what are the threats? Where are the threats? What about our infrastructure? What are we doing? And all the rest of it. And it's synergizing really, really nicely with that continuous pen testing piece as well, and the bug bounty systems. And, we're seeing a lot more movement in the direction of understanding and knowing where we are as an organization, or where my customers want to know what they're doing as an organization, over traditionals, which is let's just go in and buy a million different tools with a million different dashboards and chuck them in. And then you find out that nobody's been updating the IDS, IPS for a long time, or it's still in learning mode, which I still find now, time and time again. Understanding what's going on within the environment and the wider world is so much more important. And I am seeing a lot of that legislation, I know we talked about it before, starting to go down that route of pushing for that kind of understanding. Is that kind of in line with what you're seeing from your customer base as well?
Yeah, I think legislation for me, it's and particularly we mentioned this earlier, regulatory compliance drives behavior, but I would still want to see organizations driving, and it sounds again a little bit cliche, but driving that security culture so that we imbue in everybody this belief in the sanctity of our operations and our customer data. And this, particularly with contingent workers and the gig economy, this becomes harder to mandate, because if you've got somebody on minimum wage, and they're struggling working a 40-hour a week job to feed their family, you can't then give them that sense of urgency and criticality, and that idea that what they are in charge of is defending data that's critical to customers and stakeholders. I think that then relates to other things, other economic conditions, like the need to invest in training and the need to remunerate people well. But, let's start with regulatory compliance, because it at least drives executive behavior. I think that we need to connect that top down. The fines are important, but let's see if we can get everybody, security, primarily, and security to spearhead these things, but then network operations and even, what you might call commodity administration tasks, all thinking the same thing. What is this email that's coming in? Have I seen anything? Is somebody shoulder surfed me into the organization? Is there anything peculiar in, poking out of the network closets? All these kinds of things, because that culture of security and that belief that has to come from everybody, that the operations and the work that we do is important, and the security of those operations is even more important. Let's see if we can get people thinking about their workplace and the data that they work with with the same enthusiasm that they do about securing their own houses, because the two are closely related. We're all dealing with criminal syndicates and nation states in various guises, and it becomes very, very important for people to believe that what they're doing is important.
I couldn't have put it any better myself. That's great. I mean, we're reaching the top of our time together to explore, this kind of world. Where do you see the future of this line? Where do you see, that journey going to ultimately? I mean, what are you guys developing in house that is going to change kind of like the way that we are now for the better going forward? Or is that too expensive?
Not at all. No. So I'll see if I can do it in a couple of minutes. So, I mean, I think in terms of Censys, the things that we are increasingly seeing is, for example, things like supplier visibility. So you mentioned DORA. One of the key mandates of DORA is being aware of your suppliers. So the Internet Intelligence Platform that Censys has got gives you the ability to perform a thing called a collection, which is basically to look at the internet for a collection of assets that relate to a particular supplier, either via certificate, via domain name, via IP range, and say, let's monitor this for these kinds of vulnerabilities. Have they got exposed SSH or exposed RDP? And to keep an eye on that, to keep a vision of the supplier, so that, when you're interacting with a supplier like that, you can be sure that they are at least walking the way that they talk it. Everyone will have compliance questionnaires like this from their suppliers with all of the S boxes ticked. Yes, we do this. Yes, we audit. Yes, we secure access. But those practices will only manifest in the attack surface if they're being enforced and if they have that kind of that passionate approach to security. So what you can do is you can take those compliance questionnaires from a supplier and say, does this correspond with reality? Are they constantly checking their attack surface? Are these exposures being closed in due course and in good time? And so that continual visibility from a supplier perspective is something that we're taking very, very seriously, because it's necessarily an extension of your own infrastructure. If you have a clear and diligent view of your own external attack surface, then the next step removed is that of your suppliers, especially if they've got collaborative connections with your company. And again, that supply chain vulnerability that we seem to keep coming back to in this conversation is very, very critical here, because, you know, ultimately what we would like to see is people choosing the suppliers based on their security posture. Because again, that's a secondary way that you can hit the bottom line. If you're not investing in security and you're not, defending the data of your collaborators effectively, then you'll start losing business. And that's another way that we can start to enforce the good practice. I guess the other thing is continual visibility. The scanning perspective, the infrastructure, keeping it updated, making sure it's relevant, making sure risks are prioritized, making them actionable, deeply embedding ourselves into SOC automations and workflows. So, for example, if you see a new vulnerability, let's tell the SIM about it. Let's tell the VM solution about it. Let's make sure that everybody knows if there's a new CV announced. Censys rapid response capability is a 24-hour service level on the announcement of new CVEs. Brand new CVE comes out. If it can be profiled using an internet scan, we tell our customers about it in 24 hours. This is often before any of the other major intelligence sources can do it. So it's basically going to be about velocity, about visibility, about business collaboration, and about improving the quality of integration and automation.
I couldn't agree more. Totally agree with absolutely everything that you said there. And I think, the tools are getting so much better now for us to be able to understand what's going on at any one particular time. As I said before, in the old days, trying to figure out what was going on in an environment could take days, weeks, and it would be teams of people. At least now we have the tool sets that allow us to do it a lot quicker. I mean, we can't get rid of the people. Yes, for all of you out there that are hoping that AI will take over the security roles. Yeah. Let's think about that one for a minute. But but this is it. It's a supportive technology. Anything that can analyze that 20,000 log set faster than I can. I mean, I don't want to do it, and I've had to do it in the past. But I think you're absolutely right. It's the speed that we operate at, and the ability to react as quickly as we can, because, historically, by the time you knew there was a problem, you were already screwed, and that's always been the case. At least now we have the ability to try to beat our opposition. But something that you mentioned earlier on, and I think it's very true, there's always going to be people out there who are very creative and find interesting new ways to get around things. But absolutely. But no, Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you and Censys on, for our Spotlight on Technology. Where can people find you and the organization out on the web? Obviously, you've got a web address. I'll kind of hand over to you now and let you kind of tell people where they can find you.
Sure. I mean, probably the best place to start if you want to start exploring the internet at large is search.censys.io, which is our internet-facing search engine. You can choose any asset, any exposure, any certificate, and start poking around on it. Censys.com, obviously, from the perspective of the wider organization and some of the offerings. And my email is npalmer@censys.com, N for November, N for Nick, Palmer, all one word. And anybody who wants any more information can just make me direct. But Jim, it's been a pleasure to be on. Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed chewing the fat with you.
No problems at all. And to all of you out there watching, thank you ever so much for coming and joining us on this podcast. It's absolutely fantastic. We hit our milestone now of over 10,000 subscribers, and we're growing quickly as well. I mean, it's not just hitting that 10,000 mark. We've gone way above that. So please like and subscribe. If you're not subscribed already, hopefully we're providing you with content that you can look at and go, you know what, I'm going to subscribe today. It really helps the algorithm, and it really helps get the message out about what information security really is about. And that's what we're talking about here. So thank you, Nick. And to all of you out there, we'll be seeing you again soon with brand new content that we've been working on over the last couple of weeks. Thank you ever so much, and we'll see you again soon.
In addition, I do have a book recently come out, the Cyber Sentinels Handbook, a primer for information security professionals. Now, this book is very much geared up towards professionals at all levels of their career, be they starters, be they newcomers, be they people who've been in it for a little while and maybe looking for a little bit more direction, albeit the older ones looking to maybe reground themselves in some of the more important aspects of the trade that maybe they've forgotten over time. I've had lots of good feedback from a lot of different readers of lots of different levels, so please feel free to get yourselves a copy. We've got the e-copy, we've also got the paperback copy, and if you don't want to spend any money, you can go on Kindle Unlimited and read the book for free there as well. So thank you ever so much again. Look after yourselves, and we'll be seeing you again soon.